You spend a third of your life sleeping. On the frontier, that third was when you were most likely to die. And I'm not talking about attacks or fires. I'm talking about what was already in your bed, waiting every single night. Modern people worry about mattress comfort and room temperature. Frontier settlers worried about whether they'd wake up at all. The bed itself was a threat. The room was a threat. Even the act of falling asleep was dangerous in ways that would shock you. Forget those cozy Western movie scenes of peaceful sleep by the fire. Real frontier sleep was a nightly gamble with your life, and the odds were way worse than you think. Let's talk about what frontier families actually slept on, because calling it a bed is being extremely generous. Most frontier beds didn't have spring mattresses or cotton padding. They had straw ticks, basically fabric sacks stuffed with whatever was available. Straw, corn husks, prairie grass, even dried leaves. Sounds rustic and charming, right? Here's what that actually meant. That organic material was a perfect breeding ground for insects. We're not talking about a few bugs. We're talking about ecosystems. Bed bugs, fleas, lice, mites, spiders, all living and breeding in the same place you tried to rest your head each night. One frontier doctor's journal describes examining a straw tick that had been in use for 6 months. He wrote that the mattress was so infested with bed bugs that it appeared to move on its own when disturbed. This wasn't unusual. This was normal. These weren't just annoying bites. Frontier bed bugs carried typhus. Fleas carried plague. Lice caused trench fever. Mites caused scabies that could become infected and turn septic. Every night you were sleeping in a disease incubator. Studies of frontier medical records show that over 60% of frontier families reported chronic night fevers and skin conditions. They didn't know they were being systematically poisoned by their own beds. And you couldn't exactly throw your mattress in the wash. The mattress was just the foundation. Let's talk about what you slept under. Blankets were wool if you were lucky. Most families had 1 or 2 blankets total, shared among multiple people. They rarely got washed because soap was precious, and drying thick wool took forever. That means whatever bacteria, sweat, oils, and skin cells accumulated just stayed there for months, sometimes years. These blankets became biological weapons. Shared blankets spread tuberculosis, pneumonia, and skin infections faster than any other household item. One Wyoming homesteader's diary mentions that her family's blanket could nearly stand on its own. She wasn't joking. The accumulated filth had made it rigid, but washing them could kill you too. Frontier soap was made from lye and animal fat, strong enough to cause chemical burns. Many women had permanent scarring on their hands from laundry. So, you chose sleep in filth or risk permanent injury cleaning it. The bed frame itself, another nightmare. Most frontier beds were rope beds, literally rope woven across a wooden frame. Over time, the rope stretched and sagged, creating a hammock effect that destroyed your back. The rope needed constant tightening. Too loose, and you'd wake up with chronic back pain that frontier medicine couldn't treat. Too tight, and the rope could snap while you were sleeping, dumping you onto the floor. But here's what nobody expected. The wooden frame was another insect hotel. Bed bugs would hide in every crack and crevice during the day, then emerge at night. You couldn't escape them. So you've got a disease-ridden mattress, filthy blankets, and a sagging rope frame full of insects. But the bed is just your sleeping platform. The real question is, how many bodies are crammed onto it? Privacy is a modern luxury. On the frontier, it didn't exist, especially when it came to sleep. Most families lived in one-room frontier cabins, maybe 12 by 14 feet. That's it. That's the entire living space for a family of 6 to 8 people. Now think about where everyone sleeps. Most families had one bed, maybe 2 if they were wealthy. That meant parents plus multiple children all sleeping in the same bed, not by choice, but by necessity. Common sleeping arrangement. Parents on one side, children on the other, youngest in the middle. sometimes head to foot to maximize space. Body heat was necessary for survival, but it came at a cost. When one person got sick, everyone got sick. Respiratory illnesses spread through families like wildfire. Tuberculosis, influenza, whooping cough, these weren't individual illnesses. They were family extinction events. Studies of frontier mortality show that 43% of frontier children died before age 5. Many from communicable diseases contracted during shared sleep. One illness in a crowded bed often meant losing multiple children within weeks. One mother's letter from 1872 describes losing 3 of her 5 children to influenza over the course of 2 weeks. She mentions they all slept together for warmth and comfort. The comfort killed them. Disease transmission wasn't the only issue with cramped sleeping arrangements. Zero privacy meant zero personal space, ever. Married couples had no intimacy. Teenagers had no independence. Children had no sense of individual identity. Frontier journals and letters frequently mentioned cabin fever, but it wasn't just winter isolation. It was the psychological pressure of never being alone, even in sleep. Some historians argue that the high rates of frontier violence and mental illness weren't just from hardship. They were from never having a moment of psychological respite. Sleep should restore you. On the frontier, it just continued the stress. And for women and girls, the lack of sleeping privacy created another layer of vulnerability. Frontier records rarely discuss this directly, but reading between the lines of women's diaries and letters reveals the constant fear and lack of safety that came with having no private space, even during the most vulnerable hours. But even if your family situation was safe, your sleeping space still wasn't, because you weren't the only ones trying to get warm at night. Here's something frontier movies never show you. What else was trying to sleep in your house? And I don't mean relatives. Frontier cabins weren't sealed structures. Gaps in the floorboards, walls, and roof let in weather and wildlife. Mice and rats didn't need an invitation. These weren't occasional visitors. They lived in the walls, under the floors, and in the roof. At night, you'd hear them constantly. Scratching, squeaking, fighting. But the noise was the least of it. Rats and mice contaminated food supplies, chewed through stored fabric and blankets, and left droppings everywhere, including on your bed while you were sleeping. Frontier rodents carried hantavirus, plague, leptospirosis, and rat bite fever. One bite, or even contact with their urine or feces, could kill you. In Montana Territory between 1870 and 1880, medical records document at least 200 deaths directly attributed to rodent-borne diseases contracted in sleeping areas. Families tried everything. Traps, poison, cats. Nothing worked for long. The rodents always came back. Every night, you went to sleep knowing they were there, moving in the darkness. Mice attracted predators, and some of those predators were worse than the mice. Snakes, including venomous species, would enter frontier cabins hunting rodents. They particularly liked the warmth of beds and sleeping bodies. Multiple documented cases exist of people waking to snakes in their beds, being bitten while sleeping, or children being bitten during the night. Snake bite treatment on the frontier was brutal and mostly ineffective. Frontier doctors would cut open the wound, apply various poultices ranging from tobacco to gunpowder, and hope for the best. Survival depended on luck more than medicine. One Kansas homesteader's journal from 1876 describes his wife being bitten by a prairie rattlesnake that had crawled into their bed, seeking warmth. She survived, but lost 2 fingers to the subsequent infection. Their 3-year-old daughter had been sleeping between them. Snakes were rare visitors. insects were permanent residents. Beyond the bed bugs we mentioned, frontier sleepers dealt with mosquitoes carrying malaria, fleas carrying plague, ticks carrying Rocky Mountain spotted fever, spiders, including black widows and brown recluses, centipedes, and scorpions in certain regions. There was no bug spray, no screens on windows, no sealed doors. If a window or door was open for air circulation, necessary in summer, insects poured in. If everything was closed, necessary in winter, you trapped the insects inside with you. Medical records from frontier settlements show that insect-borne illness rates were 3 to 4 times higher than in established eastern cities during the same period. What modern people call camping discomfort was frontier life, but even if you could ignore all the creatures sharing your sleeping space, you still had to deal with the biggest killer of all, the temperature. Modern thermostats let you set the perfect temperature and forget about it. Frontier families spent every night trying not to freeze or burn to death, often at the same time. Frontier winters regularly dropped below zero. Inside the cabin, without insulation and with gaps in the walls, temperatures might only be 10 to 15 degrees warmer than outside. If the fire went out, inside temperature matched outside temperature within hours. Families kept fires burning through the night, but wood burns out. Someone had to wake up every 2 to 3 hours to add wood, or the fire died. This meant no one got proper sleep. Parents took turns waking to tend the fire. Sleep deprivation accumulated over months, affecting judgment, health, and reaction time, making every daytime task more dangerous. In Montana County between 1870 and 1875, 43 children died during sleep from exposure. That's documented. 1 every 6 weeks. These weren't people caught outside. These were people who froze to death in their own beds when the fire went out. One Nebraska homesteader's diary from January 1873 describes waking to find her youngest child had stopped breathing during the night. The fire had gone out around 3 a.m., and the temperature inside the cabin had dropped to 15 degrees. The child's lips were blue. Extremities, fingers, toes, ears, noses were exposed even under blankets. Frostbite during sleep was common. People would wake up with blackened fingers that had frozen while they slept. The impossible choice: stay too far from the fire and freeze, or sleep too close to the fire and burn. Because fire was its own danger. Open fires in wooden structures full of combustible materials and sleeping people created constant risk. Sparks would ignite straw mattresses. Blankets would catch fire. Children would roll too close to fireplaces. Smoke inhalation and carbon monoxide poisoning in poorly ventilated spaces killed silently. Studies of frontier death records show that 18% of frontier cabins experienced at least one significant fire, and 31% of frontier deaths from fire occurred at night when people were sleeping. If fire started at night, you had seconds to react while disoriented from sleep. No smoke alarms, no fire extinguishers. One small fire could engulf an entire cabin in minutes. A Colorado settler's account from 1881 describes waking to flames already consuming the cabin's south wall. He managed to grab his wife and 2 of his 3 children before the roof collapsed. His 5-year-old son didn't make it out. Winter cold killed quickly. Summer heat killed slowly. Same cabins that couldn't hold heat in winter couldn't let heat out in summer. Temperatures inside could reach 110 degrees. Combined with humidity in certain regions, or the dry heat of desert territories, sleeping became dangerous. Open windows for air meant inviting insects, snakes, and potential intruders. Close windows for safety meant risking heat stroke and suffocation. Records from Arizona Territory show elevated infant and elderly mortality during summer months, with many deaths occurring during nighttime hours when temperatures inside structures remained dangerously high. But temperature wasn't the only invisible killer lurking in frontier sleeping spaces. Every breath you took while sleeping was a gamble, because the air in frontier cabins was toxic in ways people didn't understand. Wood smoke, cooking smoke, oil lamp fumes, and later kerosene fumes filled frontier cabins. There were no exhaust systems, no ventilation fans. Smoke just accumulated. Breathing smoke all night, every night, for years caused chronic respiratory disease. Period medical records describe cabin cough and frontier lung, conditions we'd now recognize as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and emphysema. Improperly ventilated stoves and fireplaces produced carbon monoxide, invisible, odorless, deadly. Families would go to sleep and simply not wake up. One Iowa homestead in 1879 lost all 6 family members overnight to carbon monoxide poisoning from a poorly installed stove. A neighbor found them 3 days later, when smoke was seen coming from the chimney, but no one had been spotted outside. They looked like they were sleeping peacefully. But smoke wasn't the only thing you were breathing. In cramped, unventilated spaces, respiratory illnesses spread rapidly. One person with tuberculosis coughing in a sealed cabin meant everyone was exposed continuously. Analysis of frontier medical records shows tuberculosis mortality rates in frontier settlements were 40% higher than in eastern cities. Entire families would be wiped out by respiratory epidemics that started with one cough in the night. Frontier families didn't understand disease transmission. They thought bad air caused illness, but didn't realize that sick family members sharing sleeping space was the actual vector. They'd try to treat the sick person, while continuing to sleep inches away, breathing the same air all night. And then there was what was growing in the walls. Frontier cabins leaked. Water damage led to mold and rot. Sleeping in moldy, decaying structures caused chronic respiratory issues and allergic reactions. Autopsies performed on frontier settlers who died from respiratory causes frequently showed lung damage, consistent with chronic mold exposure. The very structures meant to protect them were slowly poisoning them. But even if you survived the air, the temperature, the creatures, and the disease, you still had one more problem: the nighttime attacks. Being unconscious for 8 hours made you vulnerable to more than just environmental threats. It made you a target. The frontier had minimal law enforcement. The nearest marshal might be days away. That meant criminals operated with impunity. Home invasions, robberies, and worse happened during sleeping hours when families were most vulnerable. Studies of frontier crime records show that 42% of violent crimes occurred between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Claim jumpers would attack homesteaders. Cattle thieves would eliminate witnesses. Outlaws would target isolated cabins. Families slept with guns nearby, but being suddenly awakened and expected to defend yourself in the dark against multiple attackers meant survival was unlikely. One Wyoming Territory incident in 1877 involved a family of 5 attacked during the night by claim jumpers. The father managed to fire 2 shots before being killed. The mother and eldest son were also killed. The 2 younger children survived by hiding under their bed. They were found 2 days later, still hiding, too terrified to come out even after the attackers had left. Even when there were no attacks, the fear itself was torture. No neighbors within shouting distance, no lights on the horizon, no way to call for help. complete vulnerability in total darkness. Frontier records show high rates of what we'd now call anxiety disorders, PTSD, and paranoia. One Kansas woman's diary entries from 1873 describe being unable to sleep more than an hour at a time due to fear of attack. She writes about hearing every sound, imagining threats in every shadow, and the constant state of terror that came with nightfall. Chronic sleep deprivation from fear, discomfort, and necessary fire tending caused hallucinations, impaired judgment, and worsening mental health. Fear prevented sleep. Sleep deprivation increased fear. The psychological toll was as deadly as the physical dangers. And if this was terrifying for adults, being a child made it worse. Frontier children experienced all of this with even less understanding and control. Period accounts describe children's nightmares, fears, and the psychological impact of growing up in constant danger with no sense of safety, even during sleep. Those who survived childhood carried trauma that shaped entire personalities and communities. The tough frontier spirit we romanticize was often just normalized trauma. So why did anyone endure this? And what can we learn from how they adapted? Despite everything we've just covered, millions of people survived frontier sleeping conditions. But survival came at a price. Most history books don't mention. Frontier families developed clever adaptations. They'd heat stones by the fire and wrap them in cloth to place in beds for warmth. They'd hang herbs and plants believed to repel insects. They'd sleep in shifts with someone always awake to tend the fire and watch for threats. Neighbors would coordinate warning systems, using gunshots or bells to alert each other to danger. Over time, frontier communities learned what worked. Building techniques that reduced gaps, seasonal strategies for temperature management, pest control methods that at least minimized the problem. These weren't stupid people. They were brilliant survivors making do with impossible situations. But survival doesn't mean thriving. Average frontier lifespan was 15 to 20 years shorter than in established eastern settlements. Chronic health conditions from poor sleeping environments were nearly universal. Respiratory disease, joint problems from inadequate rest, psychological trauma, weakened immune systems. The psychological toll passed through generations. Research on frontier descendants shows patterns of hypervigilance, anxiety disorders, and difficulty with trust that can be traced back to ancestors who lived through these conditions. Cultural behaviors around security, preparation, and risk assessment in frontier communities originated from these nightly terrors, and the children who didn't survive. Infant and child mortality rates, specifically related to sleeping conditions, and their consequences ranged from 35 to 50% in many frontier settlements. When we romanticize frontier life, we erase the massive human cost. These people deserve recognition for what they actually endured, not sanitized myths. Tonight, when you climb into your bed, remember what that means. Don't forget to leave a like and a subscribe if you wish to help my channel grow. Thank you.